Bienvenidos, tenemos una lección de verbos que cambian ortográficamente, or in inglés se dice spelling change verbs. It's a lot easier in English. And remember, this is in el tiempo presente, so in the present tense. All right, so metas de la lección se dice goals of the lesson, and we have 4. So the first goal is to talk about the letter G and why it changes sound due to the vowel following it. In Spanish, it doesn't always have the same sound. We'll also talk about the pronunciation of and the silence of the letter U when coupled with the letter G. So therefore, there are verbs in the present tense that have to change their spelling due to these pronunciation rules, because we always want to keep the same sound as the infinitive. And then there are some verbs that have both spelling changes and stem changes together. So they'll have a consonant change, and then they will also stem change in the vowel. Okay, so let's talk about G's for a second. So not all G's in Spanish are pronounced the same. So it all depends on what vowel follows it. So the G may either be pronounced like G, which is considered a hard G, as in the word get, or a soft G like the H in the word hen. So again, you have to look at the letter that comes after the G. So G is followed by A, O, or U. Or U, it is pronounced with a hard G, and if it comes before or E or I follow it, it is pronounced like an H. So you know this already because you know enough Spanish to know that there are certain words that have different pronunciations. So here you can see them lined up next to each vowel. So the GA would make ga, GE is hey, GI he, GO go, and then GU is gu. So remember again that G before AO U is hard as in get, so that's why that is a gato, because it's G-A. And then whenever it's before an E or an I, it has the H sound, as in the word for gimnasio. So you've even learned, these words back in Spanish 1, and you learned how to change your pronunciation. This video just explains why. All right, so then therefore we have certain verbs that if they end in G-E-R or G-I-R, they already sound like hair or hear. And if we would chop off the E-R, the I-R, in the yo form and add an O, we'd end up with go. And we can never change the original sound of the infinitive. So whatever the G sounds like in the infinitive, we have to make sure it sounds the same whenever we go to conjugate it. So therefore, pronunciation is more important than preserving spelling. So Spanish actually changes the spelling of something to preserve the pronunciation. So that's really the rule for that. So, or the guiding rule. So here is an easy way to remember it. For verbs that end in G-E-R or G-I-R, G's change to J's before O's and A's. Now, you might be wondering, why would there be an A if it's an ER and IR verb? And that's kind of foreshadowing into our next tense, where you will have actually A's next to these verbs. So if we learn this now, then when we learn the new tense, it will be a little bit easier. All right, so we've got a couple verbs that do this. Escoger is one of them, and it's to choose. So yo escojo, we got to change it to a J, or we'd end up with escogo. Recoger is to collect, so yo recojo. Exigir is to demand, so yo exijo. Dirigir, to direct, yo dirijo. Proteger is to protect, so yo protejo. Afligir is to afflict, yo aflijo. So there you can see how we have changed the G to a J before an O, again to preserve the H sound, the soft G sound of the infinitive. So just to give you an example of what the entire conjugation looks like, you can see it goes back to a G because everything after the next conjugations all have E's after them. So it's back to that soft G. So escoger is escojo, escoges, escoge, escogemos, escoges, and escogen. And we've preserved that H sound all the way through. We only had to make a minor change. Okay, so having said that about G's, there's also a GU rule. All right, so we've got to talk about the GU. So the GU is not a single letter, but the combination functions like the G, the G, and then it changes sound. So before an E or an I, the GU represents the hard G sound, meaning that the U is silent. So here we have the word for war, to guide, guitar, and then the word for a worm, actually. So to pronounce those, we pretend that the U is not there. We don't pronounce it, but it's still a hard G. So it'd be guerra, guiar, guitarra, and guisano. You know that from Spanish 1 you never learned to say toco la guitarra. And this is why. The G-U-I or the G-U-E ignores the U but keeps the hard G sound. However, sometimes we do pronounce the U whenever it's next to a G, and that is if there is an A or an O after it. Okay, so here we have the word for glove and good looking and ambiguous, and then the word for old. So that's why we pronounce it guante, guapo, ambiguo, and antiguo. So I have examples there of how we get that gua sound in Spanish. So it's not always there. We don't say guitarra, we say guitarra, but we do say guante. And that's why you got to look not just past the U, or not just past the G, but what's next after the U. All right, so here's a slide that kind of further demonstrates that. So there would be gua, ge, gi, guo, and then there's never a G, U, U, but I wanted to keep the slide consistent, but you will never ever see that. Spanish would never double up on the U. So remember that a GU before E and an I is pronounced like the hard G, and the U is not pronounced. Like in the English word guide, we don't say guide, okay? So there's a guide, all right? And then the GU before an A or an O, and then a U, which is never going to happen, is pronounced gua, as in guacamole or Guatemala. That's why we pronounce it that way. All right, so therefore there are certain verbs that end in G-U-I-R. There's not many. There's only 2 that we are really, frequent, or a little bit more high frequency. So they're called gear verbs, because remember, we don't pronounce that U, so it's not guir, it's gear. Always think back to guitarra. So the GU drops the U before O's and A's. So we have extinguir, to extinguish. It would be extingo. If we kept the U in there, the G-U-O makes the U pronounced, and that'd be extinguo, and we don't want to pronounce the U in the conjugated form if we haven't pronounced it in the infinitive. So extingo, and then distinguir is to distinguish. Yo distingo. So now you can see the rest of the rest of the conjugation there. It only happens in yo because everywhere else there is an E or an I after the U, and then therefore that U is not pronounced. Think back to guitarra. So it's like extinguir, extingo, extingues, extingue, extinguimos, extinguis, and extinguen. Okay, so there's only a couple of verbs that do that. However, there are verbs that spell change and they stem change. So they're going to follow the stem change rules, which means they will stem change in the boot, and then they will follow spelling change rules, which means G's change to J's before O's and A's, and goo drops the oo before O's and A's. All right, so we got to keep those 2 rules in mind as well as boot verb rules. So we have the verb seguir, to follow, which is yo sigo. Again, we have to drop that U before an O or an A. All right, so now there's a whole bunch of seguir verbs. All right, so they all act like seguir. Conseguir is to get, perseguir is to chase or to pursue, and proseguir is to proceed. Okay, so they all act like seguir. We've learned this year that if there's a root verb in there, then there's also the compound form of the verb is going to act the same way. We also have a few verbs that end in hair and here, or actually here it's just here. So elegir is to elect, and corregir is to correct. So you can see that they are all E to I stem changing verbs, and then they also have the spelling change rules. So there's seguir's entire conjugation. So you can see that it just drops the U before the O, then the U comes back because it's sitting before an E or an I, but then the I in the stem, the SI part, stays an I only in the boot. So it's a combination between 2 concepts. And then there's an example of elegir, which is elijo, eliges, elige, elegimos, and elegis because they're outside the boot, and then eligen is back in, and it goes back to a G because it's next to an E again. Okay, so here I give you an opportunity. I think there are, how many are there? 7. So pause the video and kind of test your knowledge, do a little practice here, just like we would do a warm-up in class, and then when you come back, you can check your answers. So number 1 is, I demand, oops, sorry, I forgot. Number 8, sorry, I correct. So number 1 is, I demand, exijo. We afflict is afligimos, no spelling change there because the G is next to an I. Y'all distinguish would be distinguis, that's a regular verb there. It doesn't have to drop the U because it's next to an I. I extinguish, we're going to have to drop that U. Extingo, if not, we'd end up with extinguo, and we don't change the sound of the infinitive. She follows, sigue, don't pronounce the U. They chase, persiguen, again, don't pronounce the U next to an E. To elect, or you elect, eliges, don't forget the stem change. And then I correct, corrijo, also has a stem change and a spelling change. Okay, so next thing you want to do is fill out that Google form. There's just just a few questions underneath the presentation. Make sure I've left you a space to ask me any questions and we can address those in class. Gracias, adios.